Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Chrontendo. What we'll be doing over the course of this series is taking a look at every single video game released for the FamiCom/NES. Hopefully this will be an entertaining journey, which will give us a little bit of insight into the history of Nintendo and video game development in general. First of all, let's take a brief look at the history of the Nintendo company. Nintendo was actually founded in Kyoto in 1889. Originally, they produced Hanafuda decks, which is a sort of Japanese playing card. They eventually diversified into other sorts of card games and made attempts at such things as launching a taxi service or a chain of motels, but for most of the 20th century, Nintendo was known primarily as a manufacturer of playing cards. Around 1970, Nintendo began making toys and games. The most important individual in this department was engineer Gunpei Yokoi, who designed some of Nintendo's most successful early toys, including some early light gun devices. By the end of the decade, Nintendo had entered the arcade video game field. Most of their early efforts were somewhat derivative of popular arcade hits of the time. All of that changed with the emergence of a young game designer named Shigeru Miyamoto. Miyamoto would eventually become the preeminent personality at Nintendo, and one of the most influential figures in the history of video gaming. His career initially took off when he was assigned to create a game that could be converted from unsold copies of an unsuccessful video game called Radar Scope. The resulting game, Donkey Kong, was released to arcades in 1981 and was a huge hit in both US and Japan. It was unlike any other game on the market, and created the vogue for what we now call platform games. Nintendo followed up Donkey Kong with more arcade hits, such as Donkey Kong Jr. and Popeye. Nintendo was also looking into getting into the home console market. They had released some Pong-like games under the name TV Game in the late 70s. Shortly thereafter, a series of handheld LED games designed by Gunpei Yokoi called Game & Watch hit the market. This was Nintendo's first entry into the world of portable gaming. Finally, the year 1983 saw the Japanese release of the Family Computer, otherwise known as the FamiCom. Later, it would be released in the US in a redesigned form as the Nintendo Entertainment System. The Japanese system has a rather eye-catching red and white color design, and two controllers that are actually hardwired into the console. At the time, the FamiCom was quite sophisticated for a home console. It featured an 8-bit processor, around 2 kilobytes of RAM. It could display 16 colors and 64 sprites on the screen at one time. So let's begin our survey in the glorious year of 1983. The FamiCom was released in July of that year. There were 3 launch titles. Before the year was over, there were 6 more titles on the shelves. And the first game we'll be looking at today is Donkey Kong, a port of Nintendo's famous 1981 arcade game. As you may have noticed here, it has a very simple title screen and also something that sort of looks like a arcade demonstration mode here. Once you actually hit a button, it'll allow you to start a game, but this being based on an arcade game, it actually does have a very sort of arcade kind of feel to it. I'm sure that one of the major selling points of the FamiCom initially was that it featured some ports of 3 very popular arcade games. In fact, ports that were far more accurate than anything that had been released before for a home console. The arcade game did have these very charming little scenes between the levels, and unfortunately the FamiCom is missing those. It's also missing one of the levels, the Pie Factory level, but other than that, it's pretty accurate to the arcade version. We're looking at the arcade version here, just as a point of comparison. Now, Donkey Kong had been ported a few times to home consoles before, to give you some sort of idea of how impressive this FamiCom version would have looked to consumers back in 1983. Let's take a look at some of the other versions that have already been released. I believe that one of the first ones was for the Atari 2600. As you can see, due to the limitations of the 2600, the graphics here are really not that impressive. The movement is a little strange as well. Color scheme, of course, is completely different than anything you would have seen on the actual arcade game. Now, prior to the FamiCom, the most impressive home version of Donkey Kong was released for the ColecoVision. In fact, this Donkey Kong port was one of the major selling points of the ColecoVision when it first came out in 1982. This was considered almost miraculous at the time, despite the fact that it was actually missing one girder. It had 5 instead of 6. Now, by comparison, the FamiCom version looks absolutely fantastic. It looks almost identical to the arcade version. There are, of course, some minor differences in presentation and sound, but really, this is certainly the most impressive home console port of like an arcade game such as Donkey Kong that had ever been seen at this point. So you can see why this is really such a major selling point for consumers. The second of the Famicom's launch titles was Donkey Kong Jr. This, of course, was the arcade sequel to Donkey Kong. Came out in 1982. So this is actually still a relatively recent game. Just like Donkey Kong for the Famicom, it has a very simple title screen and like a little arcade demonstration mode. This is the actual game itself here. It plays very similar to the arcade game. It's a pretty accurate port. I mean, much more so than people would be used to have been seeing in 1983, that's for sure. As you might recall, this game is somewhat notorious for having Mario as a villain. For some reason, he has captured Donkey Kong and is trying to kill Donkey Kong Jr. He actually has like a little whip there he's using to send little monsters on. Your objective, of course, is to get to the top of the screen, and then you go on to another, more difficult screen. Basically has the exact same components as Donkey Kong, only this one has a lot more, probably a lot more jumping in it. Little platforms and whatnot. This is definitely an early platformer game. Now here's the arcade intro. Unfortunately, this is missing from the Famicom version. Just like Donkey Kong, they didn't put in the various things between scenes. Sound is a little different. If you listen to the arcade version, you'll see Donkey Kong Jr. makes this cute little monkey noise while he's climbing. Despite these minor differences, Donkey Kong Jr. for the Famicom is still a very fun, very enjoyable game. It's very much still playable despite its age, and really Nintendo did a great job porting it to the Famicom. Here we have Popeye. This was the third launch title for the Famicom in July 1983. This is also a port of a Nintendo arcade game. It came out in 1982. Perhaps not quite as popular as Donkey Kong or Donkey Kong Jr., but it was a pretty popular
game in its time. What the object here is, you go up and down little platforms and collect the various objects that olive oil throws at you. You can't let them fall into the ocean and get wet. Once you've collected enough to fill up a little house or whatever, you move on to the next level. Bluto will kill you if he touches you, unless you grab the spinach. Just like in Pac-Man, you're temporarily invincible and able to knock him out there, as you can see. It's a very cute game. It's not too terribly challenging. It's not too terribly deep. Mostly involves sort of catching slow-falling objects. The difficulty actually becomes a bit trickier in the later levels, and there's a lot more objects. Like Bluto can throw more stuff at you. There's a vulture that comes down. Things sort of go faster. So it actually does get a bit trickier in later levels. This game, I believe, has just 3 levels, all are represented here. It's a pretty accurate port, maybe not quite so much as Donkey Kong Jr., but it looks more or less like the arcade game. It had been ported into other systems, but none of them looked even remotely anything as good as this. Interesting bit of trivia is that Donkey Kong was originally intended for the Popeye characters, as in Bluto would have been Donkey Kong, Mario would have been Popeye. They couldn't get the rights at that time, but eventually they did make a Popeye arcade game. Something that is a little interesting is that these home versions seem easier than the arcade versions. I assume that's because they weren't quite as dedicated to stealing your quarters. I mean, at home you can sort of, they want the game to have like long playability, so they don't make it quite as difficult in the arcades. They want the game to be over as quickly as possible, so they put another quarter in. So this game is maybe not quite as successful as Donkey Kong Jr., but still, it is a pretty good port, and it's an enjoyable game to play on the FamiCom.
So, here we have Gomoku Narabe, the 4th title released for the FamiCom. This was not a launch title, this was released about a month after the first 3, along with another game came the same day called Mahjong. So we've gone from rather popular games such as Donkey Kong to a game that probably most folks in the West won't have already seen. This title was only released in Japan. As you may have guessed, this is based on the ancient Chinese game that we call Go. Go is actually not the Chinese name of this game. This game was first introduced to Westerners through Japan, which is why we refer to it by the Japanese name. What's interesting is that this is not really the game of Go. This is actually sort of a simplified version in which the object is to try to line up 5 pieces in a row. This is sort of like that game you might remember as a kid where they played checkers called Connect 4. The object of the actual game Go is to sort of surround your opponent's pieces with your own pieces. This is obviously a little different. You'll see in a second here where white attempts to block, black's attempt to get 5 in a row. The title of this game translates into something like 5-eye arrange. So it sort of indicates the goal of this game is to try to get 5 pieces in a row. I can't really comment too much on the quality of this game because I'm not really much of a Go player. This game is obviously simpler than the real game of Go. There seem to be a couple different gameplay variations available. Now I suspect most Westerners, sort of instinctively won't be too interested in this game, but it's a lot of fun, so you should at least try playing a couple rounds of it. I think this game is quite a bit simpler than the actual game of Go. Go is something that's sort of like chess in the sense that once you've learned the rules, you still have quite a ways to go before you actually understand how to play the game well and the various strategies involved. One thing that's interesting, apparently it's very difficult to actually develop a computer program that can play Go well. it's actually easier to design a computer program to play chess than it is Go. Supposedly, even the best Go playing programs can't really beat the average human player that has some skills. Nintendo would eventually go on to make other Go games, and some are probably quite a bit more interesting for the actual Go player. However, this one is notable, at least in the sense that it's the very first one for the FamiCom. Released on the same day as Gomoku Narabe, we have Mahjong. If you're like most Westerners, you've never actually played the game of Mahjong. There is a different game, sometimes called Mahjong, which you might recall appears on Windows PCs. This is actually a game called Shanghai. It's a matching game that uses the Mahjong tiles. Now, unlike Go, Mahjong actually isn't an ancient game. It only dates from around the 19th century or so. It's sort of like a card game, only instead of cards you have small painted tiles. Just like a card game, you have several different suites. For example, you see the pieces that have the dots on them, or the varying number of bamboo sticks. There are other kinds of tiles as well, for example the ones that have the Chinese characters painted on them. In real life, Mahjong is normally played with 4 people. What you see in the arcade versions or in the console versions such as this one is sort of different gameplay variation that's designed for only 1 person. Now odds are you don't know how to play Mahjong, or you perhaps don't know how to play it very well, so it's sort of difficult for me to comment on whether this is a good game or not. I don't really play Mahjong myself. However, in the East, Mahjong and Mahjong video games are enormously popular, so it's not surprising that Nintendo released one so early in the lifespan of the FamiCom. So, hot on the heels of Mahjong, we have a game that I'm sure you're familiar with, Mario Brothers. This was the game where Mario and Luigi first sort of stepped out of the shadow of Donkey Kong, started their own game. It was a pretty big arcade hit back in 1983. This FamiCom version actually came out in 1983, so it was a pretty new game. This was definitely Nintendo's most recent arcade hit. It's being ported here to the FamiCom in a very, very accurate version. This looks and plays an awful lot like the arcade game. There are a few spots where they've had to remove a few things. There are a few differences, but it is pretty accurate. For those not familiar with this game, and I'm sure there probably aren't many of you, it's now revealed that Mario and Luigi are plumbers. Apparently they are in the middle of a very serious plumbing situation. Someone here is having a variety of turtles, crabs, fireballs coming out of the pipes. The object of the game is to knock over the various animals by first hitting them underneath, then basically just sliding them off. Every time you do this you get a coin. The coin theme was, of course, used many, many times in Mario games. If the animals get to the bottom and go into the tubes at the bottom, the pipes at the bottom, they usually emerge from the top a little bit angrier. Once this happens, they usually take 2 hits to dispatch, rather than just 1, like the blue turtle that you see here. Now, of course, the turtles, the crabs, these are enemies that would keep turning up over and over again in various Mario games. This game does have a bonus level, as you can see, which exists only to help you collect coins. Now, one thing about the controls that are a little strange in this game is that you can't actually change your direction once you're jumping. As you may have seen there, if you jump straight up and you hit the controller, you can't move to the left or the right. You actually have to be moving already when you jump, and then you'll continue to jump in that direction. Like a lot of games of this era, there's really not much plot. Basically, you just, every time you clear a level, you go on to the next level, which is slightly more difficult. The levels do change a little bit. There's like an icy level later in the game. The enemies get more difficult. These crabs all take 2 hits to kill, rather than just the one for the turtles. These animals do actually have names. The turtles are called shell creepers, the crabs are called sidesteppers. Later, the turtles, of course, you would know as Koopas from Super Mario Bros. Now, at this point, September of 1983, Nintendo may have been wondering what they were going to do next. After all, they had just exhausted their supply of well-known arcade games. Donkey Kong Jr., Popeye, and now Mario Bros. They were really going to have to start coming up with new ideas if they wanted to continue to release games for their the FamiCom system. So, what did they do? Well, I guess their first idea was sort of exploit the properties they already had and sort of base some new games around them. And we'll be taking a look at a couple of those in just a moment. Now you might be thinking, Popeye no Eigo Asobi. So this is a Japan-only Popeye sequel? Well, this sounds very interesting. Well, unfortunately, you would be wrong about that. Once you turn this game on, you'll realize it's an educational game, something that you probably disliked as a child and probably don't like any better now. What this game is basically a hangman-like game intended to teach Japanese children English words. After selecting the category, it'll give you the name of a word in Japanese, and you're supposed to pick out the English letters. You just control Popeye and have him point to the proper letter here. And there you go, that's all there is to it. As you can see, this is based on characters and the first level of the Popeye game. It's not really that much of a game, though you can't really die. If you do get a wrong answer here, Bluto will hit the punching bag and knock Sweepy over a little bit, getting closer and closer to the edge there. Boy, I hope nothing bad's going to happen. Oh, thank goodness. Caught just in time. What a relief. The second mode of the game is actually very similar, only it doesn't give you the name of the Japanese word. It's basically just like a variation on Hangman. As you may have noticed, in the upper left-hand corner it tells you which round you're on. We're currently on round 1. It looks like there's 10 rounds, though I don't know that anyone will actually have the patience to play through 10 rounds of this. While this is not exactly a bad game, it's not really much fun either. Video game manufacturers often included a few educational type titles in with their initial offerings, just to persuade parents that video games, did have some sort of use other than entertaining the kids with mindless garbage. Of course, they usually wouldn't release more than a handful. This title obviously never came out in the United States. Donkey Kong Jr. Math was the educational title that was included with the launch of the Nintendo in the US.
Now here we have baseball for the FamiCom. Very quickly notice that you get to select your teams. The teams are represented by letters, not names. We'll discuss that a little later on. For whatever reason, whenever game designers start coming up with games for a new console, the first thing that enters their mind is to do a few sports games. I guess because certain kinds of games are already established formulas, they figured, well, we'll put a baseball game, a tennis game, maybe a gambling game on there. Nintendo had already come out with a couple popular Asian games such as Mahjong and Go, so I guess they figured, well, let's try a baseball game. Baseball games had been around for quite some time, going back to the days of the earliest home consoles. They had also been releasing them for arcade games. Let's take a look at one here from the late 70s. In regards to home consoles, Intellivision was well known for sophisticated sports games. Here we have one of theirs from 1983 called All-Star Major League Baseball. This sort of thing was pretty hot stuff back in the day. This was a reasonably realistic depiction of how baseball sort of looks. You're out. Next, let's take a look at a game for ColecoVision. They were probably the most graphically advanced console at the time, even though this game has a pretty hideous color scheme. These games only came out slightly before the FamiCom version, which of course remember was late 1983. So you can see how much better looking the FamiCom games were than these Intellivision or ColecoVision games. This game was refreshingly pleasing to the eye. Nice colors, the players have different colored uniforms. The characters move around a lot better, as compared to the little guy jumping around in the ColecoVision game. This game even has two different camera angles. There's a tighter infield shot, and then a much wider outfield shot. This FamiCom game, like the earlier games, had pretty simple controls. You mostly controlled the pitcher and the batter. The buttons will either swing the bat or throw the pitch. The D-pad will enable you to position your batter, or give you a certain amount of control over what kind of pitch you're throwing. You also have a limited amount of control over the infielders and the outfielders. Once one of your players has the ball, use the D-pad to control which plate you want to throw the ball to. Hitting right on the D-pad will allow you to throw the ball towards first base, for example. One interesting thing about this game is nowhere on the packaging or on the game itself will you find any sort of copyrighted names or logos. This game was not an official Major League Baseball product, though it does in sort of a sly way refer to actual teams. If you remember the screen where you got to choose your team, you'll recall that all the teams are designated by a certain letter. For example, I'm playing Team P, the opponent is Team A. Team P wears red and white uniforms, so we can sort of infer that they are in fact the Phillies. Likewise, the computer's team seems to represent the Astros. This game, of course, doesn't give the names of the teams, but you can sort of guess who they are based on the letters and the uniforms. However, all the teams actually play exactly the same. The only difference between them is simply the names and the colors of the uniforms. This is before baseball games started getting into sort of building teams based around stats of individual players. So despite the fact this is Nintendo's first sports title, it's actually pretty good. Nintendo must have thought so because they included this in the NES's launch titles when the NES was introduced in the United States in 1985.
Next up, we have another game that you probably hated if your parents got it for you. This is Donkey Kong Jr. no Sansuu Asobi, known in the United States as Donkey Kong Jr. Math. And yes, this is a math educational type game. The object of this first round here is to collect numbers and various signs to get it to add up to the correct number there. For example, you want it to In this case, get up to 866. Start off with 50. This is a two-player game. There's a little pink Donkey Kong Jr., I guess it's his sister here. So we grab the time sign. Now I guess we're going to try to get a nice big number. Ah, see, now we're at 450. Calculate A and Calculate B are the same game, just Calculate B has larger numbers. Then finally there's this game where you have to fill in numbers for various multiplication problems. All in all, you'll find this is not a game that you actually want to play. I'm sure you didn't want to play it as a kid, and it's probably not going to be any different now.
The holiday season of 1983 saw the FamiCom becoming quite successful in Japan, and Nintendo would continue to build on that success in the year 1984. Oddly enough, 1984 saw Nintendo slow down the pace a little bit. The first half of that year only saw the release of 6 games. We'll take a look at those 6 games right now.
Here we have the first game of 1984, Tennis. Now, something you may have noticed is that Nintendo seems to be going for some sort of house style when it comes to their introduction screens. Every single one has a black background with a relatively simple title logo, and then the player options listed below, or the game options listed below, and then finally the copyright by Nintendo. This gave all their games sort of an in-house look to them. You may have noticed every single game released so far was actually developed by Nintendo, and the 6 games that we'll be looking at this episode are also going to be by Nintendo as well. I will confess I don't really like video games based around tennis very much. Not really sure why that is. One inherent problem with tennis games is that they have to depict a ball coming at you in 3 dimensions, but they have to do it on a 2-dimensional screen. It can sometimes be difficult for the player to know where exactly the ball is and when to hit it. Now, this game attempts to solve the problem by sort of positioning the playing field in pseudo 3D. As you can see, there's sort of at a perspective angle. The ball actually uses different size sprites. It gets bigger and smaller as it comes toward you or goes away, and there's also a shadow underneath it that also gets bigger and smaller. So it's visually a pretty sophisticated game. You may have noticed the referee looks an awful lot like Mario. This is one of the sort of first Mario cameos that would appear in sports games. We'll see more of him later. This game has multiple difficulty settings. This right here is at the most difficult setting. As you can see, the other player at the top of the screen there is pretty fast. A lot more difficult. The game is actually quite easy at these difficulty settings. Pretty easy to beat. This guy is much more difficult. The game controls very simply. You use your D-pad to move around, hit a button to swing. You can sort of control the strength of the swing by pressing down quicker or faster. This is a pretty enjoyable game, certainly a lot better than some of the later tennis games that would come out on the FamiCom. So if you've done some board games, you've done a couple sports games, what are you going to do next for your brand new console? Well, something a lot of game developers like to do is a pinball game. After all, pinball has been around in arcades longer than video games. They're pretty popular, at least they were in the early 80s. Why not try to make a home pinball game? Well, here it is. Here is Nintendo's Pinball. As you can see, it's kind of interesting in that it actually has two screens. Rather than simply doing one long pinball screen, they actually broke it down into two screens with two separate sets of flippers. How do you actually play the game? Well, it's a rather nice control system. With your right hand, you hit either of the buttons, either A or B, doesn't matter. That will move the right flipper. With your left hand, you hit the D-pad any direction you want, and that will move the left flipper. So it's sort of like playing a real pinball machine in the sense that you control one flipper with one hand and one with the other. A little bit better than if they, say, tried to make the A button one flipper and the B button the other flipper. If you saw the American cover of this, you might wonder, well, why is Mario on the cover holding a little platform? What does he have to do with this game? Well, Nintendo was clearly trying to make Mario into sort of a mascot. He had a cameo in tennis, and he actually has a cameo in this game. This must be one of the early examples of a sort of a hidden mini-game inside a larger video game. It's not really that well hidden. In fact, you'll definitely come across it sooner or later, pretty much by accident. On this screen, if you hit the ball into that little red circle on the right-hand side, you will go into a breakout-style mini-game. The object of the game is to try to break Pauline out. You'll actually see that here in just a second once we finally... Yeah, there it goes. Alright, so yeah, you control Mario holding the little platform and try to get Pauline out by hitting the little blocks. Really not that easy. Well, that is Pinball. A fun little game, nothing too amazing, nothing too sophisticated, but certainly very typical of an early FamiCom title. Wild Gunman. This game is interesting for two reasons. First of all, it's the first FamiCom light gun game. However, it's another first as well. Check this out. That's right, it's the first FamiCom game with speech synthesis. Wild Gunman is actually a remake of an old Nintendo game from the arcades from back in the 70s, which used a 16mm film strip. And check this out. This is the actual Japanese FamiCom light gun. Doesn't really look anything like the US Zapper. In fact, it looks like a real gun. I guess they couldn't get away with that in the US. So the gameplay is quite simple. Various characters march out and you shoot them. You try to beat them to the draw. There's actually more than one difficulty setting here. This is the easiest, where they come out one at a time. Should you try to shoot them before they draw, before it's time, you will get a foul there, like I just did. One of the harder settings actually involves two outlaws at once. And finally, if you're in the mood for a real challenge, the hardest difficulty setting has you basically in a town facing a whole gang, 1, 2, 3 at a time. As you can see, they'll appear at the various windows and doors. You have to shoot them before they shoot you. Oh, well, as you can see, I got shot. So Wild Gunman is not an incredibly innovative game. It's sort of the same thing that's been happening in arcades with light gun games for a long time, basically. You shoot at things. However, it's probably the most colorful and imaginative of the early Nintendo light gun games. As you may have noticed, this game came out in April 1984, about 2 months after Wild Gunman. Why such a long delay between games, I wonder? Well, it certainly wasn't because they spent a lot of time developing this. This is actually probably one of the simplest games Nintendo ever put out, even though it actually looks pretty good. Duck Hunt is a light gun game, and involves shooting at ducks that fly up. Probably the most memorable thing about this game is the dog that laughs at you when you miss a duck. That and the very catchy, very short little theme music that appears when your dog does come holding a duck in his hand. This game was pretty popular at the time. This was one of the launch titles. It was actually included when you bought the version of the NES that had the Zapper in it. Everyone had this game, and a lot of people played it. I guess it was entertaining in its simplicity. Beyond that, there's really not too much to say about Duck Hunt. For those who are up for more of a challenge, there's a third option is for shooting at clay pigeons. Those are, well, they're a lot harder. They're smaller, they're faster, they fly off in the distance. They're a lot harder to hit, but there's also a pretty ugly, boring looking game as well. I think Nintendo must have realized that when people played this game, the thing that they really wanted to do was shoot the dog. When they came out with a arcade version of this, there was a bonus round where you could shoot the dog. You wouldn't kill him, of course, but he would complain when you shot him. So, what can we conclude about Duck Hunt? Well, I guess it is kind of charming, and it is fun to play in small doses. From May of 1984, we have Nintendo's third sports title, Golf. Something you might notice here is that there's no music. That Golf only has sound effects. There's no music during the title screen or during the demonstrations screen. As you can see, you can control the direction of your shot by, actually it's done by using the left and right on the D-pad. Has the same little sort of shrinking growing ball as you saw in other games like baseball and tennis. You can change the club by using up and down on the D-pad. Right now we have a 4-iron. Game comes with a standard selection of clubs. There's like a driver, some irons, putter, that sort of thing. Now this game is actually in some ways sort of revolutionary. Of course there had been golf games before this. There were some very simple ones on the 2600 for example. There were also some arcade golf games. However, the actual mechanism for hitting the ball is quite new. A lot of the arcade golf games at this time used a trackball. That is, you would hit the ball and then you'd roll the trackball as fast as you could to get the ball to move. This game, however, introduced, at least I believe this is probably the first game that used this sort of three press system here. What you do is you hit the button once, that'll bring your golf club back, hit it a second time to stop the arrow, and then hit it a third time when you actually hit the ball. Now the second time, the further back the arrow is when you press the button the second time, the further the ball will go, the harder you'll hit it. You want to try to press the button the third time when the arrow is in that little white space. That's sort of like the optimal space for hitting a straight ball. Hitting it either to the left or the right of that will cause the ball to go astray. You actually can't see that when you're putting. That's sort of why putting is actually kind of difficult in this game. It's putting that takes the most getting used to. When you first start putting, you really have no idea how far the ball is going to go when you hit it. This game definitely takes a little bit of practice. The little arrows on the image of the putting green there indicate which way it's sloped. It also is which way the wind is going, your score of course. As you may have noticed, your player looks an awful lot like Mario. This would be yet another Mario cameo, which was quite common in Nintendo sports games as time went by. For the second player option, you play Mario again, but you're in this utterly ridiculous-looking red golf outfit. Actually, I guess that seems more like Mario's style. You even get a red golf ball. So while golf is, not a really, there certainly will be more sophisticated golf games later, this one actually was quite important for its time and still remains a relatively fun game to play. The third and final FamiCom light gun game released for early 1984 is Hogan's Alley. This game is sort of interesting. It has like a little extra instruction screen there after the main title screen, showing you which targets to hit and which not to. The object of this game is basically exactly that. When the three targets slide out, shoot the one that's the bad guy. Don't shoot the one that's one of the civilians. You're only allowed so many misses. I believe you can get 10 misses in a row, and then it's game over. Now you might be wondering, what exactly does the name Hogan's Alley mean? Well, Hogan's Alley was the name of a training facility. I believe the first Hogan's Alley was possibly opened by the U.S. Army, in which you would shoot at targets. Some targets would be painted to resemble enemy targets, and others were painted to resemble friendly targets, and of course you had to quickly decide which ones to shoot at and which ones not to. I'm sure you've sort of seen things like this in movies or television, where like a police officer in training has to go through like a Hogan's Alley type situation. The FBI themselves opened up a Hogan's Alley at some point around the same time this game was made. So in other words, this game is sort of like a police officer training simulator. You have to practice your marksmanship on these little cardboard cutouts. The second option on this game is where you actually sort of get to go down an actual alley with various cardboard cutouts appearing in windows and doorways, sort of like Wild Gunman. We'll take a look at that now. Perhaps visually a bit more interesting. I guess it might be a bit more fun than just having them sort of come out three at a time. I've always wondered, is that one guy in blue wearing a tuxedo? It was very nice of him to get dressed up for such an occasion. This game is also notable as it has one of the earliest instances of sideways scrolling in a FamiCom game. Of course, later the platform would be sort of known for that. The last gameplay variation on Hogan's Alley is Trick Shot. This is where you shoot at cans to keep them up in the air, try to land them on a platform. How high or how low the platform is will determine how many points you get. So, this will wrap up the first episode of Chrontendo. Thanks for sticking around. I guess if we were sort of to take a look at these games in retrospect from July of 1983 to June of 1984, we'd say that, well, none of these games are exactly bad. Most of them aren't really too terribly exciting at the same time. They're all sort of very simple games. They sort of take a certain kind of action and sort of repeat it over and over again. I mean, of course, the arcade ports are classics, Donkī Kong and Donkī Kong Jr. and Mario Brothers, but Nintendo's original titles for the FamiCom haven't really showed too much originality yet. In the second half of 1984, things will start to change. A lot of interesting things happen on the FamiCom in the next year, so hopefully we'll see you around for episode 2.